Andi, welcome to the Sisterhood and Happy New Year.
Thank you for having me. I'm so glad to hang out with you guys today.
Yeah, so fun. So you are in New York. Tell
Yes.
us about what it's like living in New York.
I mean, what do you want to know? There's so much. I love living here, and we have raised our 4 kids here. I mean, they're not totally raised. I've got 16, 14. How old are they? Does anybody else do this? 13,
Yes.
13 and 9. And so it's been a wild ride. We've been here the last 11 years, and we live in a beautiful community in Brooklyn, and we also have a roommate. So we just love to pack it in, and we all, it's the city right now in this season. And even as we are stepping into January, is like just coming alive again. So it's been kind of beautiful to see after the last few years, just kind of things waking up again. But it's been great raising kids here. I feel like the best way I can explain it is, I mean, we pastor a church here. We pioneered one 11 years ago. And it's been like, my kids, I would say they're more like missionaries in the city. So they don't really have friends that are believers or anything like that. So the family unit ends up being very strong because this is the place of discipleship when they come home and learning. But it's beautiful. We've got great food, really good pizza on both ends of my street. It's a really great pizza, great bagels. It's a real problem because
Okay, yeah, there we go.
Yeah. So
carb up, baby.
But it's great. It's beautiful. We love it.
And your husband's from Australia, is that right?
Mm-hmm. He is.
So how did you meet?
Oh, good story. Well, I love that before we started to hit record, I can't believe it, Krista, that we are both from Spokane. Okay. So yes, I am born and raised in Spokane, but I got saved when I was 19, and a year and a half later, moved to Sydney, Australia. I thought, why not just give a couple of my years of my life to just Jesus and going to a Bible college there. And I hate that I became a statistic, and I didn't even know it was a statistic because I was so new at following Jesus of bridal college. I was very embarrassed. I was like, what? Like, I didn't know this was a thing. And so he was born and raised in Sydney, and very quickly, he's 5 years older than me. And I mean, it's a really long story, but when he saw me, he's like, yes. And he was very serious and intentional and pursued me. And I had never really had that before. So we fell in love, got married, and had 3 kids in Sydney, 3 under the age of 3. Did either of you guys do that? It's really fun times. Yeah, that was wild. And then I lived there for 10 years, and then we moved to New York 11 years ago. Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah. And New York. Okay. So tell us about the last couple of years briefly, what it's been like to be a church in the city during such a hard time.
Yeah, it has not been for the faint of heart. It has been the 2 most difficult years of our collective, my husband and I, and any leader in the city, of our leadership life. I think that the absolute turnover of the city, number one. So it wasn't even just in the church, like we were the epicenter of everything at the very beginning. And we had the population of San Francisco leave New York City. And so that alone, like how that affected the church, was people that had been there from the beginning were gone. And then we were shut down. And then as soon as we could open up, we opened up, but there just so many people didn't feel comfortable to gather. And so I would say, there's multiple facets of how it hit us, but pastoring has been difficult. And to lead in a time of not just being the epicenter of the city, but you guys know, like the political divide, the racial divide, everything that we have walked through as, the people of God. It's been difficult, and it's been beautiful, and there's been a lot of highs and lows. And I would say we're in a Nehemiah season, and we're rebuilding. And so, we planted 11 years ago, and it's almost like we're starting over. So
wow.
I'm smiling, but I haven't smiled a lot. I've got a lot of therapy and help along the way. Yeah. I had a crash and a breakdown at the beginning of last year. And so, but it's been the hardest years of our leadership life ever, hands down. Yeah.
Wow. Oh my gosh. I feel like we could dive so far in there, and I'm having to restrain myself.
Wherever you want to go.
I know. But we are in this Healthy Way series, and today we are talking about friendship. And so even, I guess my first question would be, how did friendship help you through that season?
Yeah. Oh my gosh. Thank you for asking that question, because I think through the last couple of years, friendship became the absolute most precious thing to me besides the unit of my family and obviously Jesus. But I think there were a couple of friends that we just stayed really close to each other. One of them being our roommate who lived with us. What was so wild is she had moved to the city. And I said, move here. I really sense that, like, what you have in your heart is in this city. And then she moved here in January of 2020, and we hardly knew each other. We got to know each other very well. So lockdown happened, but she has become such a precious friend and my best friend of 20 plus years. The three of us became a true unit. Over this time, we started family dinners on Monday night where we'd just come together. And I think we really just held each other up through the highs and the lows and people coming and going, because there was beauty in friendship and there was a lot of grief in friendship. I mean, there was a lot of changes, a lot of relationships that in essence, like burned to the ground. And I think the collective grief of loss was something that we all had to maneuver through together. So I was so grateful for that tight unit of friends. And both of those women actually mentor my daughter too. So it was like this beautiful thing to watch how they would disciple her and we would come together. And so it honestly has been a lifeline. Friendship has been a beautiful lifeline for me. And so that's the honest truth.
Has that always been your experience, positive friendships, or can you give us a little snapshot of maybe your history with women in friendship?
Yeah, I would love to. No, that has not been. I have been an absolute failure in this area of my life. And I think that I hit, I guess, rock bottom when it came to my relationships with women about 5.5 years ago. And it got to a point where I started to notice these cycles that were in my life when it came to my relationships with women. Now, granted, I was pastoring a church. It's a unique position to make friends within your congregation too. So it's like a weird like tension, but still it's totally possible. And so anyway, all that to say, I started noticing these cycles of where I would feel like, wow, what am I doing wrong? Like relationships would just end. Some people would be mad at me. I don't know what I did wrong. And then the straw that broke the camel's back, if you will, was my best friend that I was just talking about. That was a lifeline of 20 plus years. We basically had like what I would call a friend breakup. And I do write about this a little bit in the book that I just released last year. And I think that was so devastating to me as I was like, if I have been friends with her, I've known her longer than my husband, and our relationship can fall apart. What do? I felt like the Holy Spirit said to me, hey, Andi, you are the common denominator in every relationship you're in. And that hurt, but it was also beautiful. I could take ownership of that. I could change. I could go back to move forward. So what I realized was that from a young age with my mother. Okay, so chapter 1 in this book, Friendship, It's Complicated, yeah, is called The Woman Wound. And
Wow.
I had to realize, a lot of times we'll talk about the father wound or issues that we maybe had with our dad or lack thereof because he was there or not present. I had a lot of issues with my mom. Now I have this beautiful reconciled relationship with both my mom and dad, and she allowed me to write a lot about our relationship. And even she wrote part of chapter 1. But when I was younger, my mom and dad were going through so much. And now in hindsight, I'm like, oh my gosh, I have so much grace for you guys, knowing what you walked through. Now I'm a parent, knowing I'm going to have to pay for therapy for some of my children, for what I did. So, but all that to say is I was what I would call my mom's emotional mother. I was like a therapist for her. And she would unleash on me from the time I was really little up until like my young adult years, things that were too heavy for me to fix or carry. And I learned codependency, this cycle where I needed to be needed by her and I would emotionally carry things and she would let me do it. And I realized fast forward into adult relationships, pastoring a church, that becomes a Messiah complex. That becomes very unhealthy. And you let a lot of people down because they maybe have unmet needs, unspoken expectations of you, and you don't know what they are, but you're trying to meet them, and it's a mess. So what I realized is when I chatted with my mom, And we started to work those things through. There was real deliverance and healing that came in that. But I'm giving you a very long answer to say, no, it hasn't always been amazing. But I realized I was the common denominator. I needed to do the work. I needed to go back, not just to set up camp in the valley of the shadow of death, but to move forward, to sit at that table in the presence of my enemies, where my cup overflows with a good and living like God, who shows me who I am, and it has the ability to heal me of my cyclical issues. And so I'm recovering. I'm in recovery for being a codependent actually right now. I'm in a Celebrate Recovery group with other pastors working through those issues and continuing to work on myself so I can be a better friend to others. Yeah.
So just the last thing you said, so people know, Celebrate Recovery, people are probably thinking, wait, Celebrate Recovery, isn't that about addiction and substance use? Can you talk about how Celebrate Recovery can be an avenue for people who are feeling like they're in relational brokenness to work through some of those things?
Absolutely. I thought the same thing too. I always thought that Celebrate Recovery was a 12-step program for, you know what I mean, for those that had addiction issues. So when one of my closest friends, Irene Rollins, who openly talks about her addiction, she had alcoholism as a pastor. And she was one of my friends that walked me through this season. And she said, hey, I'm really proud of you, but I think that it would be great for you to start and become a part of this recovery group that I am doing with other pastors. And I was like, well, what does that mean? And so as I dove into it more, I realized, man, they're like, if we have trauma from our childhood, we have these things that we've learned, relational trauma, codependency, self-protection, anger issues, a lot of these things that we self-protect with, and it can be addiction and alcoholism, but we all self-protect with many different things. And so Christ, I mean, think about it. John 10:10, the enemy comes to steal, kill, and destroy. Jesus has come to give us life and life abundantly. He's come to recover the losses. So therefore, as we walk with him and work with him, we're all in need of being in recovery. I'm just in a program for it. And so that's what's really beautiful. So in my group, there are some people that have addictions, some people that are codependent, some people that have relational issues. We're adult children of childhood trauma. That's what they like. There's so many different things that you can be in recovery for. And it has been, again, another lifeline throughout this time, this beautiful small group of other pastors. So that's what Celebrate Recovery is. And they have them all over the place.
So I would love to hear just how you've taken everything that you've learned and, the hard work that you've done. And that just, I think it just shows that there are two parts to this. There's God's work in the healing, and then there's our responsibility to change some patterns that we've had over years that aren't helping and that are actually hindering us. So can you speak a little bit to how did that help you pivot in relationships? What did you do differently? And what did that look like?
Yeah, well, I think it is twofold. And that's one of the biggest things that I've had to learn is number one, the one place that every single one of us can start today that's either listening or watching this is that we can take ownership. Like right now, today, we can do something different. But then there's the intentionality of starting to forge relationships with other people and doing things that maybe are uncomfortable for us. So I would say it's twofold. And number one, so that side of ownership, I think for me, I had a revelation very early on when I was following Jesus that, you know what, no one else can steward my heart for me. I remember being offended one time and it was like, the Lord was like, hey, you choose to be offended. I was like, whoa, oh, I'm offended by that statement. But I realized at that moment, you know what I mean? And I realized at that moment, oh, I have ownership over the state of my heart. And one day I'm going to breathe my last breath. And I don't get to stand before the King of Kings and go, well, that was my mom and dad's fault. That's why I'm bitter. That was my pastor's fault. That was so-and-so's fault. Like I actually get to choose to become more like Christ as I forgive, lay down my life, say things like, forgive them, Father, they know maybe what they do or know not what they do. Either way, that's on me. Nobody else can keep my heart tender for me. And so whether we need to be in a Celebrate Recovery group, whether we need to be in therapy, whether we need to be in accountable discipleship and a small group, whether we need to talk to somebody. I say this as well. A lot of times people are like, will you be my accountability partner? And they want someone to constantly call them and text them and ask them how they're doing. But I'll say this, like, we are as accountable as we want to be. Even if someone is calling you every day, you don't have to reveal anything to them. If you want to be repentant, if you want to have a tender heart, you have to make that choice. So there's the ownership piece. And that's where, even with my own mom, and she wouldn't even mind me saying this, as I remember, even as we got older and we started working things through, she'd start to use me again and talk to me about things. And I'd say, hey, mom, I think you need to go to counseling for that. And she's like, oh. I'm like, yeah, I can't be that person for you right now. And so we have to know when we've hit a threshold and we need to do something different. And then there's so that's also intentional. We have to have intentionality in that. But then there's the second side to that. If you want to build genuine relationships, you have to choose to not self-preserve. I think a lot of times what we're doing is we choose self-preservation. There's pain in that. The pain of self-preservation over the potential of messy, godly connection. And so, yes, I just need to let everybody know, when you start to step out in relationships, you're going to get hurt again. You're going to have to forgive again. There's going to be mess because people are involved, including you. And so we have to be intentional and show up for people. We have to let our yes be yes, our no be no. We have to navigate things in a place where we take ownership, but we keep stepping out. So there's many things we could talk about, but I think those are that's where the journey begins. Starts with you, but then you have to start being intentional and showing up for different things. Even sometimes for Celebrate Recovery, I don't always want to show up for that, but I do it anyway,
Yeah. So you mentioned something about self-preservation. And sometimes I think, well, maybe I'm just being discerning. I'm being discerning that I don't want to enter into a relationship where there's going to be a lot of drama and the person is going to expect things from me that I don't find to be healthy. What is that tension as far as being a person who wants to show grace and mercy and love somebody else well, and also being a person who's like, I don't know that I can totally trust all of who I am with you, because you have proven from, and this is for me, like, often subconsciously, I don't know that I'm doing this. Like, I'm not consciously saying, I don't want to be friends with you, but I think I do self-protect to a certain degree of, I don't know that I trust you with all of who I am. And so I'm going to keep our relationship a little bit surface. How do you manage that tension?
Gosh, that's a really important question, because I think sometimes you do have to, I would say, is it self-preservation, or is it, it's boundaries too, right? And I know that's like a word everyone's using at the moment, but I think it's us honestly, everybody go read Townsend and Cloud. If you haven't read the boundaries books, like, game changer, and read it over and over again, because that may be a great way to start your year, is just to read that, to understand the difference between self-preservation and having healthy boundaries. Because there are going to be people in your world where you're like, I don't trust you. My discernment is right. And you do have to pay attention to that. And sometimes all that people get is the hello, goodbye from you at church or in a different setting, because you're not meant to be best friends with everybody. So I would say it's twofold. Understand what healthy boundaries are. And I can read a part of that in a second, because I just touch on that topic lightly. But another thing that is really important, and this was something I had to learn, because I tend to, once again, codependency wants to like care for everyone, let everyone in, say yes to everyone. And that's just not healthy either. That, like, you become a doormat. And so I had to learn how to not do that. And it was like the Lord showed me through the Gospels how Jesus had friendships. And I was like, oh, following Jesus' way? What a great idea. And so, right. And I think for me, seeing that even Jesus had circles, Jesus had his three that he was very close with, brought into the intimate moments and spaces of his life that probably made the other 9 disciples a little bit jealous, because he didn't bring them into all of those spaces, but he was on mission with the 12, and there was purpose in that relationship. Then he had the 72 that he sent, and he was also on mission with them. That's usually the community that we're a part of, or church community we're a part of. And then there was the multitudes. And I think even for me, I had to realize, you know what, some people that maybe want into my life, not everybody gets to have my heart. Not everybody gets to see all of me. My friend Irene that I was talking about, she often says, be authentic with the many and vulnerable with the few. Like truly be your true self wherever you go, but not everybody gets to have your heart. Don't be vulnerable with everybody. Stop posting it everywhere and letting people comment on your life on social media. That is not wise. Have a small circle of people that you do that with, that you trust, that you build rapport with. And so those are a couple of things. I love that question because I do think it's important. There's some people you can't trust, and time again, they have proven to you that you can't. So stop going there, I would say. Yeah.
Well, it's interesting. And I'd love to hear your perspective on this, because you said you had a breakup with, one of your best friends, and yet she's now someone you went through COVID with. So there was a healing there. And so we want to hear about that healing and what happened. But I think it's the concept that often in the places we're most wounded, we actually have to enter back in, not necessarily with the same person, but try again for that complete healing. So if we've been really hurt in female friendships, it's actually often through healthy female friendships that we can find that God is healing, but also there's a piece of that we need to go back into that same place and have disconfirming experiences that are different than the others. And so can you talk to us about your healing journey with this particular friend, and then also just to that concept a little bit?
Gosh, you guys are amazing. I love the questions you ask. Yes, I would love to share that. And again, I want to honor Tanya because she allowed me to write about her as well and tell a little bit more of our story. So what I would say to people that are listening, especially if you're wondering, well, I had a friend break up, is this safe to go back into? Or is that, I love what you said, or do I need to forge a new relationship to bring healing in this area of my life? Well, with Tanya and I, the reason why it worked, the reason why there was redemption and restoration was also because there was reciprocity. Both of us were willing to own our side of the story. We were both willing to repent. We were both willing to ask for forgiveness and say, I'm sorry. And so that was very scary for both of us to hear. I mean, I'll never forget that meal where we sat down across from each other and we both shared how we had hurt each other without excuse. We didn't take out our weapons and go, well, I did that because, or it's your fault. Or we just went, oh, we owned it and said, I am so sorry that I hurt you. Will you forgive me? And then after we kind of went there, and we were both nervous. That's all I remember about that. It was it was wild. And then we both said to each other, okay, here's what I'm willing to do to rebuild again. Here's what I need. Here's what I'm not able to give you. We were very, very clear with the needs that we needed met, and the unspoken expectations that we had. We chose to speak them to each other because that's where I have noticed the downfall in many a relationship is unmet need and unspoken expectations that we have of each other. If we don't speak those, usually that's when things break down. So as we did that, and here's another thing too, Tanya and I are the same age, and she's not married. She doesn't have children. So I'm her person, you know what I mean? And so we had to be clear about that. And what does that look like? And how can I be there for you when you don't have a spouse to go home to, and all of these different things? And what does that really look like in the flow of our lives? And honestly, over the last few years, it has been the most beautiful thing. And then, so to those of you that are wondering, well, I don't think I have that with the person, I would love to rebuild with them, but I'm not sure if they want to reciprocate. Then what you're going to have to do is get that restoration with God. You're going to have to go before him, forgive them, let them go, release them, and then ask God to bring, like you said, a new relationship into your world, a healing relationship into your world to give you a new experience. And grieve it properly too, because that's painful when you're reaching out, when you want to apologize, when you want to own it, and there's no reciprocity, or you're ghosted, or it just ends. That's difficult, but you got to grieve that properly and then start again. Yeah.
Well, it's interesting because I was listening to this therapist talk, and he was saying that with agape love, agape is, God's love, and that is from God, but actually in human form, and because we're humans, we're bound by space and time, unlike God. And so that philea love is reciprocal, and that friendship love, in order for it to work, it has to require both to come at it in the same way with the same effort. Just like in a marriage, You're not going to keep loving when someone's out, cheating on you time and time again. Like, you don't show agape that, no, that's full. You gotta grab onto philea in that and say, well, this isn't being reciprocated. Like, it's a whole different story if someone has a repentant heart and they're turning. I mean, that's what that repentance means, right? You turn from that. And so it's just interesting to hear you talk about there is in that, and we're talking today about friendship, and that philea is both parties working for the relationship, and that's a key element of it. And so what do you do with that? Because I would imagine that most of us women feel like there are some relationships where we're just working a lot harder in the relationship than someone else is. And then we ask the question, like, maybe there's not a breach, maybe there's not like a big conflict, but maybe it's just like, I'm working really hard over here and I'm not getting much back. What do you say to that?
That is another one that's really difficult. And I think I would say just a couple of like really practical things. I would say just be obedient to the Holy Spirit or the nudge that you feel to do until you don't anymore. Like, if for me, a lot of times I'm like, I want to practice what I preach. So I am not going to make up some drama in my head as to why they're not reciprocating or calling me back. I'm going to keep believing the best, and I'm going to keep reaching out, leaving voice memos, sending a text. And if they don't respond after a while, then maybe it's time to just go, hey, I really love you. Maybe I have a different expectation of this relationship, and that's totally fine. But do you want to talk about it? And if they're like, no, like, then you kind of just know where everything lies. And I think that that's difficult because, again, it can be devastating to feel, because maybe at one stage, that's what I've talked to a lot of different people who at one stage, it was an amazing friendship. It was reciprocated. And then all of a sudden the balance swings and you find yourself being the only one that's investing in everything. And it's almost like the slow death of a friendship. And so be aware of that. And even though it's difficult, like, in as much as it's up to us, make peace with all men, right? So have a conversation if you can. But at some stage, you're probably going to need to stop being the only one that is making all the effort. And so even though that's hard, again, is it bad that I'm bringing up Dr. Cloud? Like, these guys, like Johnson and Cloud, because there's a really good book called Necessary Endings. Have you guys read that one? Oh, changed my life. So sometimes you have to know when there's just an ending in sight so that you can have a new beginning. And so it's being able to read that well. And even though none of us really, no one likes an ending, we all have this longing for things to just work. And so when they don't, it's really painful, but we've got to go through the grieving process properly with that.
Yeah. And I would say those clarifying questions are helpful, because I just had somebody, I don't know, yesterday or the day before, text me and say, hey, I haven't heard from you in a while. Are you okay? Like, and she had texted me. She was on my list to get back to, and she had texted me a couple of times in the last month, and I hadn't responded. And I felt awful. And it was a wake-up call for me, like, oh, this is terrible. She thinks that somehow I'm mad at her. No, everything's fine here. I am so sorry. I mean, I was very clear. I was apologetic, but she could have conjured up a whole story in her mind that wasn't true. And instead, she just asked me, are you okay? Are we okay? And it was a wake-up call to me. I need to be a better friend, because that wasn't okay for me to just let those texts hang. So I would say, be willing to ask those questions, and don't expect that it's always going to be a bad answer. It may just be that somebody is distracted with life, and I had no bad intentions. I just was a flake. And so that, I think, is helpful to ask those questions, because sometimes you might be surprised at the answer.
Listen, that encourages me, because that's usually how I hurt people as well, is I'm just like, I'm so sorry. Like, I just had 75 text messages and I accidentally opened yours and didn't respond. I'm not mad, like, but that's actually really good. Don't make up that thing in your mind. Just ask the question. That's really good.
Well, and I think it speaks to a capacity issue too. Like, I have this thing in my personality where I cannot leave people unresponded on text. But like, that doesn't mean that everybody feels that way, but because I do, I actually won't read a text until like I leave it highlighted until I can respond to it, or else because I feel so strongly about it. But then I get hurt if someone else doesn't do that because I don't do that. And so I think it's that whole thing of like, how do we just flip the switch in our heads a little bit to say, no, not everyone operates the same way as I do in relationships. And how can I have more grace for that and more bandwidth for a broader perspective of how we might move through relationships? Can you speak to that a little bit, Andi?
Yeah, I really appreciate that question as well, because I think that's something we all have to do. We all look at everybody, whether we know we're doing it or not, we all look at everyone through the lens of ourselves, right? I mean, whether that's our family of origin, the way that we do things, the way that we function, and we're always like, why can't you be more like me? I mean, I even, right?
Totally.
So I think that's why even the beauty of the story of even Mary and Martha, two sisters who obviously loved each other, but had very different perspectives on how to relate to Jesus. One wanted to serve him, one wanted to sit at his feet. Both were doing something good, but then they got angry about it. And so I think the thing for us to understand and have more grace for one another is we've got to choose to go first in that. I know for me, I talk about that, the power of going first. A lot of times we want someone else to go first and give us grace when we mess up, but we have to get better at choosing to do it first. That's like a marker of maturity, to go first and forgive people, go first and have grace for people, go first and expect the best of somebody. Even if no one else has done that for you, it actually like ends up attracting like. And then I think I have a real revelation and passion for the fullness of the body of Christ. And, 1 Corinthians 12, where it talks about we are one body, many different parts. And so that expresses itself in many different ways. And that means that God made us all very differently on purpose, with our personalities, with our family of origin, with our backgrounds, with the way that we build church, with the way. And I think a lot of the bones of contention that we have, whether that's in friendship and relationship, or how we think people should do church, or how we think people should respond politically, or whatever that is, usually has to do with our own lens and thinking people should just be more like us, instead of seeing people for who they really are and how God has made them to be, and appreciating it. And I mean, I don't know, I should have asked you guys this before we started the interview. I mean, do you guys have kids?
Yeah, we each have 4.
Okay, same. I have 4, and you guys both know, and you could both speak to this. It's like, how can 4 extremely different humans come out of one womb? Like, they
Right?
couldn't be more
Yes.
right?
Yes.
And so you love them equally, but parent them differently because of who they are. And I think if we can do that more in the way that we love other people, and go, tell me more about how you, like, just ask a lot more questions in your friendships. Like, tell me why you see things that way. Tell me what your needs are. Tell me why you operate that way. Tell me why that's a value for you. Become curious in your relationships, because then it's not just about you and what you need. You really start to understand other people too.
Yeah, it's that whole idea of which Alex and I, we've talked a ton on the podcast about: be curious instead of confrontational, instead of mad, instead of angry, be curious instead. And that's how you actually move toward people instead of away. And I think about that's what we do when we feel hurt, is we push, right? We push away. And so instead, if we take that posture of curiosity, it requires you to move forward. And that's like the opposite of what we feel like doing. So I appreciate that so much. That's really good. So in these last, couple minutes that we have, as we're really looking at how can we get healthy this year in our friendships, and how can we do friendships maybe a little differently than we've done them before, what would be your final charge for people or word of encouragement?
Couple of things. First one, and this just like came to mind, is be really intentional. Maybe what you can do, because it's the start of the year, so sit with God and just go, Lord, where do you want me to invest this year? Maybe it's one friendship. Maybe that's all you have the capacity for, because maybe you do have a whole bunch of toddlers at your house, or you've started a new job, or like whatever it is that's taking up your margin. But ask God, where can I be intentional, and what would you like me to do? For us, for me, with my two friends, that started as family dinner, inviting them to the table with everybody else in my family. But after dinner, what would we do? We'd separate and go sit on the couch together, and it changed everything. But it was intentional, and over time, it built something. So ask where you can be intentional. And then the second thing I would say for getting healthy is, wow, like maybe this is the year where, you need to step into getting counseling or therapy or opening up about whether that is addiction or relational cycles and issues, or the part of you that is the common denominator that the Holy Spirit wants to heal, that Jesus has been knocking on the door of your heart, that you've been avoiding because it is painful to go there and heal. But it is also the most beautiful thing, because usually where our scars are, what do those do? Scars tell a story of healing. And so I would say any way that you can be intentional this year, whether that is counseling or, like I said, intentional discipleship, getting into a group or a book study with a whole bunch of other people, not a whole bunch, a small group of other people where you can walk that through and grow. I would say whatever you can do to take ownership of your mental, emotional, and spiritual health, do it. And just do one thing. Do one thing consistently for a whole year. It'll actually change your life. And so those are the things that cause us to be brave enough and strong enough to go again and step into relationship, even when the last couple of years have really told us to self-preserve. It's almost like it said, go ahead, take care of only you. It's like, well, it's both and. Care for yourself, but choose to start to cultivate things intentionally again. So that's what I would say.
That's so good. That is a great word for the new year. And I loved what you said earlier in the interview about celebrate recovery, when you said, I don't feel like going, but I show up. And I do think there's so much truth to that. Like when we just show up and we make the commitment and we, get our hiney in the counselor's office, we just show up, even though if we have no idea what we're talking about or whatever it is, or just showing up to coffee with a friend because we made that commitment, things happen, change happens. Like you said, over dinner, over time, it's like that compound interest that slowly we start to change.
Yeah.
Thank you, Andi. This has been a great interview, so helpful and such wisdom. So appreciate it. And so tell people a little about your book.
Okay. So my newest book is called Friendship It's Complicated. And the subtitle is Avoid the Drama, Create Authentic Connection, and Fulfill Your Purpose Together. So it's really about dealing with your own heart and life so that you can be on mission, fulfilling the Great Commission with other women in your world. And I love what this is all about, because it's all about sisterhood. So we've really got to do the work to do that well. And we're definitely going to go there. So if you're ready for open heart surgery and just allowing God to do stuff, go ahead and grab the book. But that's what it's all about.
I love it. All right. Well, Happy New Year, Andi. Thanks so much.
Yeah. Thank you, you guys.
Bye.
Bye.